On June 4, 1967, a car took to the grid at a seaside circuit in Holland carrying an engine that had never once completed a full Grand Prix distance. Nobody in the pit lane was fully sure it would survive the race. What happened over the next 2 hours did not just win a Formula One race. It rewrote the rulebook for what a race car could be, and it is still, to this day, one of the most quietly explosive debuts in motorsport history. This is the story of the Lotus 49 and the Ford-Cosworth V8 that came with it, the engine that nearly never got built, the debut that almost fell apart twice, and the twist that meant the team that changed Formula One forever still lost the championship that very same year. We are counting down from number 10, and number 1 is the part almost nobody talks about, the reason this engine ended up more important to Formula One than any single car that ever carried it. Let's get into it. Number 10. Colin Chapman had a genius problem, and no engine to solve it with. Going into 1966, Formula One had switched to a new 3-liter formula, and every constructor in the sport scrambled to find a power plant big enough to matter. Lotus tried the BRMH-16, a colossal, complicated 16-cylinder engine that was heavy, unreliable, and about as elegant as a filing cabinet bolted to a go-kart. It won exactly one Grand Prix in Chapman's hands and broke far more often than it finished. Chapman, a man who had built his entire career on the idea that a race car should be light, simple, and almost impossibly clever, was stuck driving around in something that felt like the exact opposite of everything Lotus stood for. He needed a new engine. The problem was, nobody was building the one he actually wanted. Number 9. So Chapman did something almost nobody in his position would have dared to try. He went looking for the money himself. He turned to Walter Hayes, a Ford of Britain executive who understood motorsport's marketing value better than almost anyone in the car industry, and he pitched an idea that sounded almost absurd for a small British constructor to be proposing to one of the largest car companies on earth. Fund a brand new Formula One engine, built from scratch, designed by a small engineering outfit most casual fans had never heard of, called Cosworth. The man behind that outfit was Keith Duckworth, a stubborn, brilliant engineer who did not believe in doing things the conventional way. Ford said yes. It would end up being one of the most consequential yes in the history of motor racing, and almost nobody outside the paddock realized it at the time. Number 8. The engine Duckworth designed broke almost every convention of the era, and it was so late that it nearly cost Lotus an entire season. Duckworth's design, a compact, high-revving V8 that came to be called the DFV, for double 4-valve, was not just powerful. It was structurally radical. Instead of hanging the engine inside a normal chassis frame, Duckworth and Chapman decided to bolt it directly to the back of the monocoque and let the engine itself become a load-bearing part of the car. No subframe, no extra structure, just the engine holding the back half of the car together. It sounds simple now because every single Formula One car since has copied the idea. In 1966, it was borderline reckless. And it took so long to get right that the entire 1966 season passed by with Lotus stuck running old, underpowered machinery while the engine that was supposed to save them sat unfinished on a test bench in Northampton. Number 7. Here is the part of the story most people gloss over. This program was supposed to debut at Monaco. It nearly did not debut at all. By the spring of 1967, the pressure inside Cosworth's workshop was suffocating. The engine kept showing flashes of extraordinary power on the dyno, then failing in ways nobody could fully explain. Chapman had promised Ford a car. Ford had bet real money and real reputation on Duckworth's engine actually working, in public, in front of the entire racing world. And with the target date approaching, the honest answer inside the team was that they simply did not know if the car would be ready in time, or if the engine would survive more than a handful of laps once it was. If you are starting to feel like this story is just a slow build of problems piling on top of problems, stay with it. Because what happens next is exactly why this moment still gets talked about more than half a century later. Number 6. The car missed its Monaco target completely, and it arrived instead at a sand dune circuit in Holland with barely any testing behind it. The Lotus 49 finally rolled out for the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort on the 4th of June, 1967, and even then it was a story of two very different experiences behind the wheel. Graham Hill had been testing the car since Monaco and understood its temperament. Jim Clark, the reigning double world champion and the fastest man on the grid, was climbing into the thing for the very first time that weekend. He had never turned a wheel in it before Friday practice. And on a car this new, running an engine this unproven, that is not a small detail. That is a driver walking into a race weekend blind, in a machine that even its own designers were not fully sure would survive. Number 5. What happened in qualifying should have told everyone exactly what was coming, and almost nobody believed it. Graham Hill put the brand new Lotus 49 on pole position in its first ever qualifying session, half a second clear of the field, in a car that had barely turned a competitive lap before that weekend. Jim Clark, meanwhile, still learning the car's strange, sudden surge of power, a power delivery so violent that Hill later joked he needed a wooden board wedged behind his seat just to brace against the acceleration, could only manage 8th on the grid. The fastest driver in the world was starting mid-pack in the fastest car on the grid, purely because the machine itself was still such a stranger to him. Two men in identical cars, wildly different starting positions, and neither of them fully sure the engine underneath them would even finish the race. Quick thing before we get into the race itself. If you have made it this deep into a story about an engine most casual fans have never even heard of, you clearly care about the moments that quietly rewired an entire sport rather than the ones everyone already knows. The algorithm will not show you the next one of these unless you are subscribed, so if you want more of these forgotten turning points in motorsport history, hit subscribe right now before we go any further. Alright, back to Zandvoort. Number 4. The race started, and for 11 laps, it looked like the story everyone expected. Graham Hill converted his pole position into an immediate lead, pulling away at the front, while Jim Clark carved his way forward from 8th, picking off car after car with the kind of surgical precision that had made him the best driver of his generation. Then, on lap 11, the engine that had haunted this entire program for a year finally showed its teeth. Hill's camshaft drive failed, and the car that had looked utterly dominant just moments earlier rolled quietly out of the race. For a brief, sickening moment, it must have felt like every worry from the last 12 months had just been proven right, in front of the entire Formula One world, on the very first afternoon anyone got to see the car properly race. Number 3. What nobody in the grandstands knew was that the exact same failure was creeping up on the only car still running. Jim Clark inherited the lead once Hill retired and simply drove away from the field, setting the fastest lap of the race and controlling the finish with the kind of effortless authority that made him look like he had been driving the car for years, not days. He crossed the line first, delivering victory to the Lotus 49 and to the Cosworth DFV on their very first appearance together in a Grand Prix. Then, back in the garage, the mechanic stripped down his engine and found something that stopped everyone in their tracks. His timing gear was already damaged, in almost exactly the same place that had just killed Hill's car. Clark had won the race on an engine that was quietly failing underneath him the entire time, and it simply did not let go before he reached the finish line. Sometimes the difference between a legendary debut and a humiliating disaster is nothing more than a handful of remaining laps. Number 2. Here is the twist that almost nobody remembers about this story, the part that makes it so much more interesting than a simple underdog win. This was not the beginning of total dominance. It was the beginning of a season defined by brilliance undercut by unreliability. The Lotus 49 went on to be the fastest qualifying car on the grid almost every single weekend for the rest of 1967. Clark himself won 3 more races that season. And despite all of that speed, despite genuinely having the best car and arguably the best driver on the entire grid, Lotus did not win the championship that year. The very same engine that had just delivered one of the most stunning debut victories in the sport's history kept failing at exactly the wrong moments, handing the title instead to Denny Hume and the far less glamorous, far more reliable Redco-powered Brabham team. The car that changed Formula One forever finished the season that mattered most without the trophy to show for it. Number 1. The real story here was never about who won in 1967. It was about what this engine did to the entire sport over the next 2 decades. Ford and Cosworth made a decision after that debut season that quietly reshaped the balance of power in Formula One forever. Instead of keeping the DFV as Lotus's private weapon, they made it available to any team willing to pay for it. Suddenly, a small privateer outfit with no factory engine department of its own could buy the exact same power plant that had just won a Grand Prix on debut and go toe-to-toe with the biggest manufacturers in the world. Over the next 18 years, that single-engine design went on to win over 155 Grand Prix races, carrying constructors like McLaren, Tyrrell, Williams, and Brabham itself to world championships they never could have reached with their own in-house engines. It became, by a wide margin, the most successful Formula One engine ever built. Jim Clark never lived to see most of that legacy play out. He died less than a year later, racing a Formula 2 car in Germany, still remembered today as one of the greatest drivers who ever lived. But the engine he carried to victory on that strange, tense afternoon at Zandvoort outlived him by decades, quietly powering an entire era of the sport that came after him. So the next time somebody tells you Formula One's modern era began with turbochargers, or ground effect aerodynamics, or some famous championship battle from the 80s, remember the sand dunes at Zandvoort in 1967. Remember the pole-sitting car that broke down after 11 laps, and the tired, damaged engine limping home behind it to win anyway. That quiet, nearly disastrous debut is the reason a tiny customer engine ended up more powerful than half the manufacturers it was built to beat. If you want more of these forgotten turning points, the moments that changed everything while almost nobody was watching closely enough to notice, subscribe, and I will keep digging them up. I will see you in the next one.